Hello, and welcome to a special edition of the Book Club podcast. I'm Sam Leith, the literary editor of The Spectator, and this week I'm joined on film as well as on radio by Professor Francis Fukuyama, whose new book is Liberalism and its Discontents. Professor Fukuyama, welcome. Now, liberal is a word that, as you acknowledged in your introduction, means something very different in, say, Tennessee than it does in Muswell Hill. What exactly are the parameters of what you call classical liberalism that's the subject of this book?
Sure, it does have a very different meaning in the United States than it does in Europe. My definition of it is closer to the European one. Liberalism, in my view, is a system that's basically a limitation of power based on a rule of law and a constitutional framework that limits the power of executives. It's based on a number of philosophical presumptions. There's an element of universalism because liberals believe that all human beings have a equal set of rights, that these need to be protected by governments. In Europe, liberal parties have been associated with a kind of center-right position that emphasizes property rights and rule of law, and that's an important part of classical liberalism. But I would say that it doesn't really dictate any set of economic policies, so that, for example, Scandinavia over the last couple of generations has been governed by social democratic parties that do a lot of redistribution, but I would regard these all as liberal parties, essentially, because they all respect basic individual rights. They tax at a higher rate than other countries, but I don't think that that's part of my definition of liberalism. So it really does have to do with that foundation of respect for law and respect for limits to government power.
Yeah, and that idea that you can, essentially you can be in a liberal society and provided it's electorally endorsed, you can draw the line economically on the size of the state wherever you like. You do draw a distinction quite early in the book between liberalism and democracy. And we talk about liberal democracy in a single breath.
Right.
But you do draw an analytic distinction between those two things, don't you?
I think that's necessary. I think that liberalism and democracy have been allies for much of the last 100 years, but they're not the same thing. So you could have a democratically elected government that doesn't respect liberal limitations on power. And I'm afraid, that's really what's going on in Hungary right now, where Viktor Orban is legitimately elected, but he's used that mandate, that electoral mandate, to basically corral the media, turn over properties and control of a lot of the economy to cronies of his. And he's explicitly endorsed, what he calls illiberal democracy, where you're not going to respect the rights of individuals to the same extent as other truly liberal countries in the rest of Europe. And he does that with a certain democratic mandate. And I think this is true of a lot of right-wing populists these days, from Erdogan in Turkey to Donald Trump in the United States. They all do get elected democratically, but they are not respecters of liberal limitations on their own power.
But is that, would you characterize that as an illiberal, would you characterize that as a democracy that's continuing to be a democracy that's illiberal, or is it essentially, once we've got the power through democratic means, we're rolling back the foundation?
Well,
can an illiberal democracy be stable, or is it essentially a contradiction in terms?
I don't think it can be stable over the long run, because the first thing that these illiberal Democrats do is to try to change the electoral laws so that they will never be removed from power. So Orban has done that in Hungary. He's done a lot of gerrymandering of electoral districts to make sure that his Fidesz party really has a big advantage, despite whatever the popular vote may say. And it's been going on in the United States. I think the Republicans at a state level have been changing the rules, the rules for counting votes, such that, if we have a closely contested election in 2024, they would actually be able to override popular will, because they would award the right to assign, we've got this very strange system in the United States where we don't elect presidents by popular vote. We have this electoral college, and they want to be able to control that so that, yes, they will be able to override democratic choice in the future. So I do think that there's a good reason why liberalism and democracy are closely allied with one another. I think that if you only have democracy, it tends to erode liberalism, and then that tends to erode, democracy itself.
Yeah. Now, this idea of erosion is kind of fundamental to the book, I think, because the book is a sort of saying where we're going wrong or where liberalism is under threat. And you see it, as I understand, it's threatened both on the left and the right, as you see it. But are those threats symmetrical, and are those threats effectively arising from the same conception of liberalism, or are they...
I think that they come from different sources, but they are feeding off of one another. And so as people push the boundaries of liberalism, to extreme on the right or the left, it stimulates the other side, to push in a similar direction. But the problems are really different. So I think on the right, really what happened was the expansion of the notion of liberalism during the 1980s and 90s to something that's now called neoliberalism. Sometimes neoliberalism is just a synonym for capitalism, but I think that, more accurately, it was a kind of ideology that worshiped markets and denigrated the state to the point that it began to erode a lot of state institutions and led to a kind of globalization that looked at economic efficiency as the be-all and end-all of life. And that began to erode people's incomes. It permitted, the growth of a great deal of inequality across the world. It eroded the state's ability to regulate the activities of, large corporations, and especially in the financial sector, I think was directly responsible for the big financial crisis in 2008 because, the deregulation of that sector permitted these big banks to take, unconscionable risks, and it hurt ordinary people. And so this was a development on the right that then stimulated the growth of the left because people looked at this and they said, this is, unacceptable that we get this degree of inequality. And that's really what launched, the progressivism that you now see across the developed world.
Although the progressivism that you're specifically concerned about in this book isn't, if I'm kind of paraphrasing you right, isn't the economic one,
right?
But an identitarian one. I mean, the sort of backlash against neoliberalism globally could be seen as almost a kind of traditional Marxist position.
Yeah, so I'm all in favor of a lot of traditional social democratic policies. I actually think that, especially in the United States, we need more redistribution because I think that liberalism needs to be tempered by democracy, that is to say, by some equalization of outcomes, because liberalism by itself produces too much inequality. So
So is that we've got illiberal democracies, but there's also the anti-democratic liberalism.
That's right. That's right. So that's fine. I think, however, that what's defined the left has shifted a lot, and it's shifted for understandable reasons. Not to be based on these broad categories like social class, as Karl Marx had it, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, but to see inequality in terms of the specific injustices done to racial minorities, to immigrants, to women, to gays and lesbians, to transgender people. And so in a sense, the understanding of inequality has shifted. And, I want to be understood here. This was understandable, and it was a necessary shift in the understanding of inequality because there are different forms of marginalization that take place in liberal societies, and those specific abuses needed to be dealt with. But it also had consequences in the way that people thought about the society and ended up becoming a general critique of liberalism and the liberal individualism that kind of underlies, liberal thought. And that's really, I think, where the problem comes up.
And is your position that within the ambit of trad capital liberalism, it is possible to produce redresses for the injustices you describe without, if you like, removing that idea of individualism that's central to...
No, of course. I mean, anyone that thinks that liberal societies haven't reformed themselves in really major ways over the last, 150 years just hasn't been paying attention. I mean, we had slavery in the United States, and for all that in the U.S., there are still huge disparities in outcomes for African Americans versus white Americans. There's no question that there's been a tremendous amount of economic and social advance. And it's not a complete process, but that doesn't, I think, speak to the core of liberalism that still maintains that there's a human essence that needs to be protected by rights and needs to be protected, regardless of the racial, gender, sexual orientation of the individual involved.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned human essence, and that, to go right back down to the beginning of liberalism, you discuss, Kant and later Rawls as a sort of epicone of Kant, which, posits some quite sort of theoretical, a priori, abstract underpinnings for liberalism.
Absolutely.
But, and it is a sort of very universalist creed, I think you'd agree. But, as you also point out, it does have a very historically specific origin.
Yes.
There's 150 years of religious war in Western Europe. Is it something that can transcend that origin and become as abstract and as universal as we think it is? Or is the, because I think one of the critiques of liberalism that's sometimes made is it's very, specific to the West. It's very,
right.
It can't escape its historical origins.
No, that's true. I think that, in fact, it goes even back further beyond those wars of religion into something that's very deep within the Judeo-Christian tradition. In the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden because they make the wrong choice. They eat the forbidden fruit. And I think that story embeds a certain notion of human agency, that human beings have the power to decide between good and evil. And that moral autonomy is really the basis of a liberal understanding. I mean, that's really what holds the human race together, is that ability to make choices between right and wrong. And the specific definition of right and wrong may vary culturally, but that's something that, in liberal theory, all human beings have. And as the centuries roll by, that gets expanded into our current, democratic understanding of human universality, that all people have a right to make basic choices in their lives, where they live, how they should live, who they're going to marry, what kind of occupations they'll follow. And it, eventually comes to entail things like a right to vote, because you also should have a right to equal political power, at least equal access to the political system. So yes, it is something that's historically nurtured in Western thought. It goes back a very, very long ways. But the question, I think, is really, is it something that actually only people that grow up in that cultural tradition prize, or is it something that actually a lot of other people from other cultural traditions may partake in? And I think, the experience of the spread of these ideas outside of the West indicates that, yeah, there is maybe something, truly universal. Right, yeah.
Now, again, among the critiques of liberalism, and it's one that I think you seem to compass in this book, is that it's very good, as has sometimes been said, for democracy, more for what it prevents than for what it enables.
Right.
And the two planks, again, correct me if I'm misunderstanding you, of the difficulty of liberalism is that it has a very good way of arbitrating between competing notions of the good, but it's not very good at coming up with a notion of the good in and of itself.
Right.
And the second one is that it has trouble dealing with nations and those, the sort of essential social human groupings in which it works. Are those systemic problems with liberalism? And I mean, it sort of begs the question, is liberalism enough if it won't account for those two?
No, that's absolutely correct. So the essence of liberalism is to say, look, we cannot agree on the good life as defined, let's say, by a religious tradition. If we insist that our politics should be built around a single religion, we're going to end up fighting each other, as Europe did, after the Protestant Reformation. And so we're going to lower the sights of politics to say that we want to survive, live peacefully among one another, and agree to disagree about those ultimate things. And that means that you're not going to get a tightly bound religious community of the sort, of, let's say, John Calvin's Geneva. But that's not a bug. That's a feature of liberalism. But it does mean that if you want a strong sense of community, you're probably not going to get it in a liberal society. I think that the attraction that people have to feel about liberal societies really has to do more with freedom and the ability to, make what you want of your own life. This ability not to be told by either your priest or the government, how you ought to live, and that's something that people can take pride in. The second issue you mentioned really does have to do with the nation, and I think that is also a problem because liberals believe that all human beings have equal rights and that those rights need to be protected by governments. I think that you can actually reconcile liberal theory with the actual existence of nations because those rights need to be protected by actually a state. State is really the locus of power in the modern world, and states necessarily have limits on whose rights they can protect. And so if you live in a liberal society, it has an obligation to protect the rights of the citizens of that society. Also, people living in the society that are not citizens have rights as well at a slightly lower level than actual citizens who have the right to vote and so forth. But, the way the world is organized, that state does not have the obligation to protect the rights in countries, 1,000 miles away. And in fact, if they try to do that, that's also going to lead to a pretty chaotic world where states are able to use force, way outside of their territorial jurisdictions. So that's why I think the nation and liberal theory, need to come together. The other thing is that in a liberal society, people need to have a source of community and mutual identification. And the nation still remains a pretty strong source of that. And you just go to an Olympics and watch people, cheering for their own country. And I think that, that's an important identification that needs to be kept liberal, meaning to say you can't build a nation around race, around religion, around some fixed value.
Well, you can.
Well, you can, and that's been the source of problems, right? So that's really what we're facing in contemporary Russia, that they've got this one, notion of what Russian national identity is that's not compatible with, multiple other ethnic identities within their own society. So, it's an uneasy compromise in a sense, between liberal ideals of universal, human equality and the need for nations, but I think it's one that can actually be reconciled in practice.
I'm wondering how much that idea that there is a sort of communitarian underpinning to the liberal dispensation in any given nation state, how that's been affected, whether undermined or improved by globalization. I mean, in the sense that, when you've been talking about neoliberalism and the difficulties of allowing inequality to run riot, it's much harder to create, I guess, a juridical framework in which inequality can be reined in by the democratic process, by antitrust laws and so on. When you've got capital and, for that matter, the companies that run it are so international, they're outside the reach of any given state's laws. I mean, is that not something that causes you to...
No, sure. No, it has been a big problem that because the globalization brought about by, what I would call neoliberal ideology has put economic efficiency at the summit of all social goods, it necessarily erodes other objectives that a democratic community may, want to pursue. So this is clearest in terms of environment, where a lot of the global trade laws have actually gotten in the way of environmental enforcement because, according to the free traders, these are simply political obstacles that are meant to be protectionist rather than, serving other ends. And I don't think that that's an acceptable understanding of the way democratic communities have a right to, determine their own futures. So, economic efficiency should be one social good among, others. And it really ought to be up to democratic communities to determine the priority, the relative priority, let's say, of environmental protection against economic efficiency.
And how, obviously, democratic communities can make those decisions, but when the problems are global, when the money moves globally, it's much harder for them to do that.
Sure.
How much sort of stock do you place in the international institutions, which I guess are our best attempt to regulate those problems, the UN, the international military alliances, the EU, so forth?
Well, there's such a variety of international institutions that it's impossible to generalize. I think the United Nations has been a failure in terms of regulating security, just because of the nature of the Security Council, that whenever you get a dispute between two of those five members, you don't get any kind of action whatsoever. And I think that's been repeatedly demonstrated. On the other hand, there are other areas like public health, where the World Health Organization actually plays a pretty important role in coordinating responses to things like global pandemics. It didn't do an adequate job during COVID, but it's much better that it existed than it doesn't. And then the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, also play important roles in regulating, a lot of our economic lives, and especially the lives of poorer countries. So it really depends. In the security realm, NATO, I think, is really an important institution. Worked during the Cold War, and I think it's working today in light of the challenge posed by Russia. But I think that, especially global warming has led a lot of people to say that, the entire universe of existing institutions, because they are based on nation states, will not be adequate to meet the challenges and needs to be replaced by something more resembling global government. And that, I think, is a dangerous idea, because at a nation-state level, we have developed institutions that balance the power of the state with instruments of constraint. That's what the rule of law is. It basically says, if you have executive authority, there are certain things you cannot do to violate individual rights or to act against commonly accepted laws, and they have to be democratically legitimated. And anybody that says that we need to replace the existing nation-state-based type of cooperation with some form of global governance really has to explain how you would limit the actions of a global executive, through law or through, democratic legitimacy. And we have no idea how to do this. The idea that the United States and China and Europe can all agree on, a common set of laws and rules and then delegate serious coercive power to this organization. You just try to imagine that, and you realize why that's not going to happen.
Also, I suppose, as we've seen again and again, mature liberal democracies kind of have to be rooted in a set of customs and conditions and normative structures. A lot of the conversations we've been having, in the media has been saying, this is, a crunch point. This is the front line of the war of liberalism against tyranny or autocracy. I'm wondering, do you think that's right without qualification? Do you see the Ukrainians essentially as fighting on behalf of an idea, or are they fighting for thumos? Are they fighting for a nationalism or a sense of their homeland?
Well, look, it's a little bit of both. I actually have been spending a lot of time in Ukraine over the last 7-8 years, and have lots of Ukrainian friends, and they're doing it out of. I mean, nobody does one or the other. Everybody fights for their independence and sovereignty, even if you don't live in a democracy. But in Ukraine, I do think that people have appreciated the fact that they're living in a free society. They can criticize the government, they can say what they want, and they want to defend that right, and they don't want Putin to take it away from them. And so, what they're doing is a combination both of, patriotic defense of their sovereignty, and it's a fight for, higher ideals. And I think that to the extent that, it's a mixture of the both, that all of us have an interest in supporting that, because, that broader liberal democratic order is really, I think, what's at stake in this current war. It's not a war just about this country, Ukraine. It's really the attempt to roll back the entire expansion of the realm of liberal democracy that took place after 1991 and the collapse of the former Soviet Union.
Yeah, parenthetically, you do mention Ukraine in the book, and you say, because you've obviously been working in the Ukraine with scholars of liberalism and democratic institutions, you said that it has or had before the invasion the most complete sort of oligarchic control of the media, or anywhere in the world, which was very surprising to me, because I mean certainly, having paid attention to Ukraine more recently, I had the impression it was this extraordinarily pluralistic liberal democracy.
No, that's true. I mean, the big problem in Ukraine prior to the war was corruption, and the corruption came from the fact that much of the economy was owned by 6 or 7 oligarchs that were a kind of byproduct of the way the Soviet Union collapsed. What's remarkable is that that structure has really crumbled now, and Ukraine has experienced a kind of birth of a nation that really would not have been possible but for the invasion. So the oligarchs have all fled. Their properties are being confiscated or destroyed.
Confiscated by the Russians?
Confiscated by the Russians.
By the West,
really.
Right, okay.
Like Rinat Akhmetov, who was the big kind of pro-Russian oligarch in eastern Ukraine, just had his largest steel factory bombed by the Russians.
He was pro-Russian?
Yeah, he tended to be pro-Russian, before the invasion. None of the Russian speakers, as far as I can see, have any sympathy now for Russia, given what they've done in Kharkiv and other, Russian-speaking
Were these oligarchs generally Russian speakers?
No, they were divided.
Right.
I mean, some were based in eastern Ukraine, some in western Ukraine, so there was variety. But I think that whole earlier division has really been replaced by an extraordinary sense of national unity around Zelensky and around the idea of a free Ukraine. So Vladimir Putin is, I think, going to be remembered as one of the fathers of the Ukrainian nation, when this is all, over with.
And Zelensky, who, most of us have come to consciousness of as a sort of war hero president, how did you rate him before all this happened? I mean, you're obviously someone who understands Ukrainian politics pretty well. Was he deeply implicated with these oligarchs? Was he ruling by permission of them?
To a much less extent than other Ukrainian politicians. He had been linked at the time of his election to Kolomoisky, who was one of the oligarchs who owned the TV station where Zelensky's show Servant of the People originally aired, and there had been a lot of suspicion that he was acting on Kolomoisky's behalf. I think that after he became elected, he proved that actually wasn't true. They continued to act against Kolomoisky's interest. There was a big bank, reversal of a privatization that they were trying to contest, and he didn't manage to do that. And I think that, the thing that was remarkable about Zelensky was that he was the outsider candidate that was elected over other candidates that were much more representative of oligarchic interests by an incredible margin, which indicated that, the Ukrainian people as a whole really wanted an outsider that wasn't connected to any of the existing corrupt elite. What happened after he was elected was that those same oligarchs then tried to corrupt, the parliamentarians in his own party, and so there's a continuing struggle. But I think to a much greater extent than previous politicians, Zelensky was free of that kind of oligarchic control.
So his being elected in the first place would be, you'd say, an instance of liberalism and the rule of law?
No, absolutely, and democracy, and something that would be completely impossible in Russia, for example.
Francis Fukuyama, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you for talking to me.